Hi everybody, welcome to week 12, and as you can see right here, I say the title of this is New Public Administration versus New Public Management. There's actually a little more to that, and I'm going to get to that in just a second, so let me move right into that. Okay, so this is what I say. I say we're going to talk about New Public Administration versus New Public Management with something called the refounding movement thrown in for fun. Here's what I'm talking about here, and this particular lecture, you should really think of as a supplement and a background for the readings that I have assigned you. So I assigned you readings so that you can discover what are these philosophical positions called New Public Administration versus New Public Management, and this idea of something called the refounding movement, which was a contemporary really with somewhere in between New Public Administration and New Public Management. There's also another philosophical position that we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks called New Public Service. But all of these are really philosophical questions about how we respond as public administrators. They're really concerned with this question of whether public administration as we know it is actually effective. And they all ask questions and provide some suggested responses about what our responses should be. Because, at its core, the idea of public administration is implementing policy which is designed, at least in theory, to provide the betterment of the American state and the American people. And so how do we as public administrators respond and manage? But all of these philosophies, each of them is grounded in the notion really that we do live in something like the administrative state, and that's probably not going to change. So as background, most of the following slides are going to talk about this administrative state. I really couldn't think of what week to put some of this information in, so I put it in this week really as necessary background to give you the idea that these philosophies didn't just spring from nowhere. I mean, if our governments, I should say, didn't have the size and scope that they do now, these philosophies probably don't have as much context to them. So here's the discussion question you're going to respond to this week. And at its heart, what I'm asking you to do is compare these philosophies, given that in the last half of the 20th century, and now we're up to 2018 in the 21st century, government is much more involved in our lives, and we as the people are probably more dependent on government. And I typically call that governments because there is more than one government with involvement in our lives and in the economy. So I'm asking you to compare the philosophies and tell us all what resonates more with you. Okay, so the rest of this presentation, the rest of this entire presentation really does not relate to any of those readings. I'm going to leave it to you to read and digest those readings and let them illuminate you given a specific setting. And that specific setting is this question: is government big? Okay, so in this presentation, there's going to be a lot of links. What I do in this version of the lecture is I'm going to show you the pages that all of these links link to, but in the non-narration version of the PowerPoint slides, then you can actually click on the links and go to these websites. But I'm going to show you the front pages that pop up when you click on these links. So first, if you click on this link here, we want to ask the question, is government big? This takes you to USA Gov, which is a national government, federal government site, and this only talks about the federal government. And so here we see there's this A to Z index of U.S. government departments and agencies. Well, there's a lot of them. And when you scroll down on this, you'll see the very many agencies that are in our big government. So really, just by the number of, even the number of the names of agencies in the United States government, we could say, I think, that government is big. And so everybody loves an organizational chart, right? This is the government of the United States. Looks simple enough, but you know, it's different than the way the founders envisioned it, right? So at the top we have the Constitution, and then you see that we have the three main branches. Really, the Article 1 branch of government is the legislative branch. The Article 2 branch of government is the executive branch. The Article 3 branch is the judicial branch. That's our government of the United States. That's what the Constitution says. What the Constitution also says is that Congress sets up administrative departments. It sets up departments. So among the first departments actually set up by the Congress were the Department of State and the Department of Treasury. So those were two of the first cabinet level departments. So directly under our constitutional government, we have these cabinet level departments. And so these are the secretaries of, right? The Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Education, etc. So each of these cabinet level secretaries is appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And so really, when we get down to that level of government, that is pretty much what the founders envisioned as the government. Now, what they also said in the Constitution, what the founders wrote, is that Congress can set up departments, and it also says that Congress can do all the things that are necessary and proper, essentially, for carrying out the goals of the Constitution. So underneath that, in that box that you might have a hard time reading, it says independent establishments and government corporations. So here are a lot of the things that we hear about typically, right? We hear about things like the Environmental Protection Agency, which is in the first column on the left, about halfway down. We hear about things like the Federal Communication Commission. We hear about, during election years, things like the Federal Election Commission. We hear about things like far right column, top one, the Peace Corps. We often hear about the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System actually controls monetary policy independently in the United States. But here's the important linkage for all of this very big government of the United States, not even talking about state and local governments. Congress set all of this up at one time or another. So the notion that bureaucrats set up bureaucracies, it might seem that way, honestly, and sometimes bureaucrats might even act that way. But in point of fact, Congress set all of this up. And in theory, Congress could take all of it down. And that's a very important point to remember, that legitimacy does derive from the idea that Congress, over 200 plus years, has established all of the agencies of the United States government. But how did we get here, right? So the original departments, which are typically the things called the Department of, were established to take care of the core functions of government. And so, like I mentioned in the previous slide, among the first were foreign affairs, which is a function taken care of by the State Department. The military function was taken care of the War Department. The naval function, by the way, was taken care of by the Navy Department down there. So in 1947, we formed something called the Department of Defense, which was really a combination of two, essentially, cabinet-level departments into one cabinet-level department with the other services that we added on up to that time, the Marines and the Air Force. And And so the idea of revenue collection and expenditure disbursement was the Treasury Department, an early department. The idea that the United States needed a legal representative, that was the Attorney General. So the original core of government were these departments of. Then we come into the era of westward expansion and national economic development in the mid 1800s, say. We formed the Interior Department in 1849. Congress formed it. In 1862, Congress formed the United States Department of Agriculture, which really was a beginning of what's called clientele service functions. So the United States Department of Agriculture was really formed initially to promote agriculture. And so it's important to take that in context, that the USDA was formed at the same time that we had the Homestead Act and we were building the Transcontinental Railroad, meaning the United States wanted people to settle in the West. So my ancestors were homesteaders in Nebraska, for example. They got land under the Homestead Act. Well, the Department of Agriculture existed to aid and advocate for those kinds of farmers in the West. And here's really a question. Does size of the statute matter? And again, here I have some links which you can link to. And I just kind of want to talk about how maybe one thing that creates a big government, if we want to use that term, is the amount of language we use when we establish things, the amount of language Congress uses when it establishes departments. So here I compare the act actually establishing the Department of the Treasury in 1789, then the act establishing the Department of Energy in 1977, and the act establishing the actual full Department of Education in 1979. So you can click on this. You'll see the link here, but the act actually fits into about 2 screenshots on a typical computer. Establishing the Treasury Department. It has 8 total sections, so it's about 2 pages long. The act establishing the Department of Energy is 49 pages long. The act establishing the Department of Education is 29 pages long. Now, so the question is, which department does more vital work for the United States, Treasury or the Department of Education? I don't know, but I know that Treasury handles all the money, and it was established with an act of 2 pages. So it's very interesting that Congress has become more all-inclusive and more directive in the way it establishes departments over the past 200 years. But now we enter another level of government. We have regulatory agencies, and these are often the ones that we call commissions, sometimes administrations, which makes it confusing. But these are what a lot of people are talking about when they refer to the deep state. That these are agencies that are designed specifically to regulate various industries, and that is true. So the Interstate Commerce Commission was the first one in 1887, and it was established to regulate railroad rates in response to an outcry by farmers that monopolistic railroads had unfairly squeezed farmers. So this is actually a really interesting context here because it's illustrative of the involvement of government in the economy, but also sometimes the conflict within government itself. Remember I said the USDA really was formed to advocate for farmers, and it did that, and it does that. Congress passed the Trans-Pacific Railway Act, which really provided funds and the guarantees of debt for the Central Pacific Railroad from the west and the Union Pacific Railroad from the east, from Council Bluffs and Omaha, to build the Transcontinental Railroad. So in effect, the government really, it was a public-private partnership to build the Transcontinental Railroad. It was built by private railroads, but those private railroads were backed in their bonds to build that railroad, and they were also given a lot of incentives, particularly a lot of land that came with the right-of-way of the railroad, which they could sell or use, and they did both. So here we have the federal government advocating two industries, if you will, farming and the railroad industry. Well, soon the railroad industry charged, in the view of many farmers, too high a rate to move their produce. And so the Interstate Commerce Commission was formed by Congress to actually regulate rates. In other words, the Interstate Commerce Commission said that rates will not be a strictly free market enterprise. We will regulate them. So regulatory agencies typically have a governance structure that is bipartisan and is supposed to represent the interests of both the legislative and the executive branches. So some examples are the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, the Social Security Administration, the Food and Drug Administration. So I have a link there to the Federal Trade Commission about how its commissioners are elected. But then we have these things called administrative agencies. So we call them agencies, but it gets confusing because agencies are also sometimes called boards, authorities, and administrations. So we use that term administrations for a different kind of agency. So it does get confusing. But usually these have a specified task or a mission set. They might be executive agencies under the president, or they might come under a department's governance. So there's the Central Intelligence Agency, which is in charge of intelligence. NASA is in charge of the space program. But there's things like the National Security Agency, which is an intelligence agency that comes under the Department of Defense. However, it's all part of the entire intelligence gathering set of agencies. And then there's regulatory power, and it usually applies to a specific mission set. But just to keep us confused, for example, the Food and Drug Administration also makes rules for prescription drugs, but the USDA also enters into the food equation. So the USDA and the Food and Drug Administration are both involved in food. And then we have things called government corporations, which for a lot of us confuses the situation even more. These are often formed by the federal government, but then they're operated as basically either a private-public partnership or just like a corporation. So the FDIC, the Tennessee Valley Authority, Amtrak, the United States Postal Service actually is an independent corporation, even though we have a Postmaster General. And I'm not even talking about things like the Smithsonian Institution, the National Institutes of Health. I'm not talking about the National Science Foundation. I'm not talking about any of those things. So the fact of the matter is, it does become frustrating for a lot of the citizenry to actually just stand back and try to take in the scope of the federal government. And that is understandably frustrating, I think. And so that is where, in my opinion anyway, people do form the idea that government is just way too big and unmanageable. So here I want to talk, though, about statute law versus regulations. And this is important. And I give you some documents that talk about this idea of what is law and what is regulation. So statutes are those things passed by Congress. They provide broad social and economic goals and legal requirements. They get their power from the Constitution. They're reviewed by courts for constitutionality, and they are really an example of representative democracy, that Congress acts to represent the will of the people. But then we have regulations, and regulations affect us as well as citizens. They are issued by agencies. Right? So the EPA does issue regulations, for example. They get their power from Congress. So, I mean, rhetoric aside, the authority for the EPA to issue regulations comes from Congress. They prescribe specific legal requirements to meet congressional goals. So, what am I saying here? What I'm saying is laws are often written establishing agencies that tell the agencies to actually write regulations in accordance with the goals that are in the law. And that is what agencies theoretically do. Regulations can be reviewed by courts to determine constitutionality, to determine if the agency overstepped the limits of its delegated authority and to determine whether the regulation is arbitrary and capricious. And this is done. And finally, it is an example actually of participatory democracy. The idea that regulations are passed in secret without an opportunity for public input is actually false. And so it's important from my perspective, and it's not just my opinion, but the opinion of many people, both statutes and regulations actually do provide examples of our constitutional democracy in action. So here are the powers of some of the commissions and agencies. For example, the Securities and Exchange Commission is an example of an agency with powers similar to all three branches of government, meaning it has legislative powers, that is, it promulgates regulations governing what information must be given to investors, and then it has judicial powers. It can conduct hearings to actually determine guilt and issue punishment to violators of these regulations. So the SEC does fine violators who violate the Securities and Exchange Law. And then it has executive powers, and that means it can enforce regulations by prosecuting violators through disciplinary actions and stop orders. And so agencies do make rules, but how do they do that? And I'm going to go into the next section and talk about the Administrative Procedures Act and some other acts that have to do with how agencies make rules. So this not very confusing slide is the U.S. rulemaking process. So over on the side, you see that there's the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of our government, and then there's the public, which is all of us, right? So this is how the rulemaking process starts. Up there in the upper left-hand corner, Congress passes a law authorizing or requiring regulations, right? So Congress says, write a regulation to deal with this situation. So the agency develops a proposed rule. At that point, down at the bottom, there are stakeholder or input consultations. So I should have said that, of course, every law that Congress debates, the public, there is a chance for the public to provide input through hearings or letters or any other kind of consultation. But every time an agency develops a rule, there is consultation from the public and from key consultants and constituencies. Then the OMB actually officially proposes the rule if it's significant, and there are meetings on request. So if it's an EPA rule having to do with the mileage of vehicle fleets by auto manufacturers, you can be sure that the auto manufacturers are involved in this process. So then the agency publishes a rule in the Federal Register, which starts a clock, and then there's an opportunity for public notice and comment. And if you follow the Federal Register every day, not that you would, but if you actually looked at this Federal Register, it's an online product every single day, you would see there's always opportunities to comment, and you as a citizen can comment on those, and citizens do. Then the agency takes the public comments and the stakeholder comments and incorporates them into a final rule, and the OMB publishes this final rule and has meetings on request. So again, if it's very controversial, there still may be more meetings from stakeholders. And then at the far right, when the agency publishes the final rule, it could still be challenged in court. The court could still vacate all or part of the rule. So it is a process that does have public input. So there are a few key laws in the rulemaking process. The Federal Registry itself was established by the Federal Registry Act of 1935. So what that did was it established this book. It was a book at the time called the Federal Register, big thick phone book looking thing that had all of the information on rulemaking in it. So now it's an online product, and it changes literally every single day because there's new rules being published or there's new calls for public input. And so this website that I have there actually changes every single day. The Administrative Procedures Act of 1946 tried to bring regularity and predictability to the rulemaking process. So that meant that it actually tried to take the variability out of the process. And so agencies had to publish a notice of proposed rulemaking. That notice had to include the legal authority under which the rule was being considered, and the notice had to include the terms or substance and the persons affected. It established that interested persons of the public had a chance to comment of at least 30 days, and that a final rule can't become effective until after the public comment period. Later, the NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, actually established rules for environmental regulations. So it's related to the APA, but it actually has this specific context, and that is environmental protection. And so this was actually part of the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency and rulings on the environment. And so this is where significantly we got the idea of environmental impact statements for proposed regulations. So anytime something happens that would have an adverse environmental impact, we have to have environmental impact statements. So this is really the important aspect of NEPA. And then we have something ironically called the Paperwork Reduction Act of 1980. And this actually established the idea that that an Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs under the OMB had a chance to review rules and have up to 60 days to determine if the rule should be implemented. So again, agencies have directions from Congress, but they also have to make sure that the administration, whatever administration happens to be in office, approves of the rule as well. And then finally, an act that actually has gotten a lot more play lately in the last couple of years is the Congressional Review Act of 1995. What the Congressional Review Act of 1995 did, it was an attempt by Congress to put itself back in the rulemaking process, and gave Congress a chance to issue something called a resolution of disapproval passed by both houses of Congress, even if the rule's already gone into effect. And so this act actually has been used since the beginning of this current administration by Congress to actually eliminate some rules. And so, yeah, there are other laws that have to do with the rulemaking process. And one of the readings is this document from Congressional Research Service. It lists a lot of those other laws. And then finally, I give you where the Federal Register is, and along with what is called the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, which is the whole listing of federal regulations that actually carry the force of law in the United States. So, does that connect? Yes, its background and its context. We do have a large federal government. I haven't even talked about the growth of the size of the state governments and local governments. They have grown in parallel ways, really, primarily since the end of World War II. And so governments at all levels have grown across the United States. So now I'm not really here to debate the question of, is the government too big? You could argue that if you want in this question. What I'd like you to focus on for this particular question is, given that the federal government is involved in our lives and the economy to this large extent, which of these philosophies that you read about in the readings seems to resonate with you more in terms of how we as public administrators should conduct ourselves? So that's the question I'd like you to respond to in that context. I'm really looking forward to your answers because I think it's very important. Thank you.